the theoretical part. Then we'll have a practical part where you can explore how GraphQL works in a playground. And the way how this is going to work in general is that we'll probably switch between the practical and the theoretical part. So I prepared a couple of slides, but for a few slides we have a couple of instructions, so you get some time to actually try out the things that I was talking about. Then we are going into the actual demo and the live coding part, where we are going to build a real-time chat application with GraphQL. And then hopefully we also have a bit of time for questions and a discussion. So let's start with the GraphQL introduction and the big question, what is GraphQL? So very, very briefly stated, it's a new API standard that was developed and open sourced by Facebook in 2015. So it's roughly only 2 years old. And it's a query language for application programming interfaces, also known as APIs. So a lot of people think because GraphQL has the suffix QL, query language, that it has something to do with a database. Must be something like SQL to query, to query information from a database. This is not actually true, and this is one of the most common misconceptions about GraphQL. It's not a database technology, it's an API technology, really. And it effectively enables a declarative way of fetching and updating data against an API. And we'll see an example right now of how that works. So who here is familiar with REST APIs or with the concept of REST, where you have a number of endpoints that you can get your data from on the front end? Most people probably have heard of REST or worked with REST in one form or another. So let's consider this example of a blogging application where we have the following profile screen. So on the top of that profile screen, we want to display the name of the user and then all the posts that the user has written. And in the end, we also want to display the last 3 followers of that particular user on our profile screen. So how would we tackle this situation typically when we have a REST API? With the REST API, we would kind of need a server or an API that is structured like this, that exposes these 3 endpoints. The /users ID endpoint that returns information for a given user with a specific ID. The users ID posts endpoint that returns all the posts for that given user, and the users ID followers endpoint that would return the followers for that particular user. When we now want to implement that screen on the front end, we would have to go and fetch our data from these 3 different endpoints. So at first, we send a GET request to the user's ID endpoint, and that will return the data of the user back to the server. And what we already noticed is that in the data, in the payload that we receive from the server, we receive a lot of data, potentially even more data, depending on how your model actually looks like. But we only need the first name, so we're downloading information that is not required in the application at that point in time. But at least we have the name of the user now and can display it on the screen. Then we do the same with the ID posts endpoint, where we ask for all the posts of that user. And again, we are potentially downloading a lot of additional information. So here we also download the content of each post, maybe the comments. So again, we have a lot of data that are putting weight on the user's networking plan. So it will cost the user money, and it will slow down the performance of the application because more data is transferred over the wire, and more data has to be processed once the data arrives in the application. So it's really not a desirable situation to be in. But again, at least we receive the titles that we want to display, so we can display them on the screen. And we'll do exactly the same for the followers. We're hitting the user's ID followers endpoint, and we're getting the corresponding JSON blob back from the server. So how would we tackle the same situation with GraphQL? One really important difference between GraphQL and REST is that with REST, you always have a number of different endpoints that each return fixed structures of data. With GraphQL, you only have a single endpoint that returns flexible structures of data. So the way how this works is that the client the client application can send a query to the server, and the server is going to resolve that query and send back exactly the data that the client asked for. So it's like a smart endpoint. You can somewhat think of it that way. So with GraphQL, we would actually only need one single request where we would send a query that might look like this. And one important difference also compared to REST is that with REST, you usually use HTTP GET as the main method to fetch data from the server. With GraphQL, you always send POST requests to the server so you've got more space where you can put the query, and that is, of course, in the body of the POST request. So here we send over that query where we can ask for the data that we need. So we need a user with a specific ID, we need the name of that user, the posts, but only the titles of the posts, and then only the names of the last 3 followers. So we can very, very precisely express the data, the data requirements that we have on the client side. And the server will respond with a JSON object that looks like this, where we get exactly the data that we need in the shape that we were asking for. And we can render everything at once here on the screen. All right. Another question. Who has never sent a GraphQL query before? Very nice. Okay. Who knows the first big company right after Facebook introduced GraphQL? There was one big tech company that also created a public GraphQL API. Who knows who that company was? Yeah. GitHub, exactly. So what you can do now, you can go to that GraphQL GitHub API and play around a little bit with GraphQL. We'll take 3, 4, 5 minutes. But you can get a first understanding of what it feels like to send a GraphQL query. So here is the URL, developer.github.com/v4/explorer. And I actually have that open here, so if you have no idea what you should be typing, you can type the query that you see here on the left side. So here on the left side, you've got the query editor, where you can write a query. And the cool thing about this query editor is that it features a fully auto-completion where you can hit Control Space and it will show you all the fields which you can select right now about your query. And then you can hit the play button up here and you'll see the result of your query here on the right side. All right, so let's take a couple of minutes and everybody can send a few queries, and then continue. And please, if you have any questions, then raise your hand, and I think a couple of my co-organizers can also probably help out if you have any questions.
Ja.
So if anyone has problems, just raise your hand so we don't just lose you right in the beginning. Is everyone authorized and so on? So Yes.
Okay, so who of the people who just raised their hand when I asked if they had never sent a GraphQL query now has sent a GraphQL query? How many first-timers for the GraphQL queries do we have? All right, that's very nice. How was it? Very nice, right? Yes. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so now I want to talk about a couple of core concepts that you have to be familiar with when you're working with GraphQL. And the first one of these is queries. So queries are the mechanism, the tool in GraphQL that you're using to fetch data from the backend. And a query is structured like this. So in the very beginning, you've got the operation type, and that, in this case, is query. And just as a side note, in total, we've got 3 different operation types in the GraphQL specification at the moment. And that is, we have the query, which is also the default type. And the fact that it's the default type means that you could potentially leave it out, so you don't have to actually put it there. We then have the operation name, which is also optional. You don't have to give your query a name. And then we have a number of fields. The first of these fields is called the root fields. And all fields together, including their arguments, are called the selection set of the query. So queries are used for reading data, but usually when you're working with an API, you also want to be able to somehow make changes to the data that you currently have in the API. And the way, okay, let's first talk about how the response of the query could also look like. So here we've got the same query again, and the response of the server when you're sending that query to the server could look like this. So we receive, again, a blob of JSON, and the root field of that is called data. And all GraphQL responses that you're going to receive from your servers will always have this root field because this is specified in the GraphQL specification. And what's very nice about a GraphQL query then is that the query itself always exactly matches the structure of the response. So you can somewhat think of a query as an empty JSON object that you're sending over to the server, where that JSON object only contains the keys of the data that you actually want, and then the server is going to fill in these values for you. Now we're getting to mutations. So when you want to make changes to the data that you currently have stored in the backend, either you want to create new data, you want to update or delete existing data, that is done with mutations. And mutations write, but they also read data. And again, what's nice about mutations is that they follow the exact same syntactical structure as queries. So again, in the beginning, you've got the operation type. Here, this is mutation. Then you have an operation name, again, which is optional. And then you have a number of fields. The first one is called root field, so create message. In this, mutation is the root field. And here, we only ask for the ID of that message that we're creating. And exactly as with queries, the server is going to respond with an object that has this root field called data, and then it follows the structure of the fields that we were sending over in the mutation. All right, let's get to the next practical part with GraphQL playgrounds. What we're going to do here is that at first, you will get the instructions once I have finished, so we will do it like this, that I will start, and then you get some time to reproduce what I showed you. So let's go ahead and create our first GraphQL server. And what's important to realize about GraphQL is that that GraphQL itself is only a specification. So it's actually, so it's basically just a long document that describes in detail how the request and response format of a GraphQL client and server exactly look like. So it's just a long document, But if you want to use GraphQL, you have to go and implement that specification on the server side yourself in any programming language of your choice that is capable of providing a web server. So you could build it in JavaScript, but also in Java, Scala, PHP, really in all kinds of programming languages. And the way how we are going to use a GraphQL server today is with the Graphcool framework. And the way how we are going to do this is by creating a new GraphQL server with the Graphcool CLI, which you're going to install in a bit. So you can just watch what I do for now, and then you get the time to reproduce this. So the very first thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to bootstrap the file structure for my GraphQL server inside a new folder that is called server. So I'm using the GraphQL init command, and I'm passing this server argument here, which refers to the name of the folder which is going to be created. So now we created this server folder here. And if I go into that folder, we see that we have a couple of files. We've got the graphcool.yaml file, which is kind of the root configuration file for your server. We're not going to take a look at that because right now we're interested in the types.graphql file, which contains the data model of your application. And we do write some types into that in the beginning. Where is it? Here. I don't know why it was opened here. All right. And I actually prepared the data model for that. So instead of using the default types, which are already part of that file, we're just going to use the data model that I created or prepared, which is the one for the real-time chat which we're about to build. So we have a person type and a message type, and the person type has an ID, a created add field, and an updated add field. And these three fields are system fields, which are read-only and managed by the Graphcool framework. So you cannot set the values for these fields, but you can set the values for the name and the messages field. And here on the message type, we've got the same situation. We've got the ID, created add, and updated fields, and then the text for the message, and a one-to-many relationship between the person and the post type, so that one person can send multiple messages. All right, so once we have this file in place and we have the data model configured, we can go ahead and deploy the GraphQL server, so we actually put it into production. And the way how we do this is by using the GraphCool deploy command from inside the server directory. So here I'm calling GraphCool deploy. And this is, so here we choose a shared cluster. I have to provide some data. Make workshop will be the name of the service for now. And this is going to spit out the actual HTTP endpoint for my GraphQL API. So here we now have the endpoint which you can use to send queries and mutations to. You can take this endpoint, you send a post request to it, you put a query into the body of that post request, and the server is going to respond. But what does the API actually look like? It is actually an API that provides a CRUD operations for your model types. So I just created this, the whole server based on the person and the message type. And CRUD is short for create, read, update, delete, which means we now get a CRUD API that allows you to create new instances of these types, update, delete, and read instances of these types that we have defined. So now if I'm going to my browser and I paste in the endpoint of my API, we're going to see a GraphQL playground. And here in this playground, it works in a very similar way as the editor that you were just using for the GitHub API. Again, you have the auto-completion feature here as well. And you can just use it to ask, for example, all the persons which you currently have stored in the database. Of course, we don't have any persons yet. So let's go ahead and send our first mutation. Maybe create a person first. We have to provide the name, and we send that mutation. So this person was now created in the database. If I send the all persons query again, we actually see that this person was now created. If we wanted to create a message that was sent by that person, we can go ahead and send a text. And then we have to provide the ID of the person who should be the sender. So now I'm grabbing the ID of the person that I just created, pass that here, and I'm creating the first message in the database. And if I now go back to the all persons query and also ask for all the messages of that person, we'll see that this message is now also returned. All right, so this is what you're going to do now. Here are the instructions, relatively brief. So what you have to do, you have to go to this GitHub repository and follow the instructions that are in the README that explain how you can grab the code, how you can create the GraphQL server, and then you have the task to send a couple of mutations and a query to the server. And please raise your hand if you have any questions.
Das ist langsam.
Ich habe schon zu viel. Weil der alte war extrem langsam. Hast du ein NVM drauf?
Is it working? Du kannst jetzt mal einfach mit der normalen bedienen.
Das ist die Last.
Who could not yet clone the repository? Who has trouble cloning? And when you call the GraphQL deploy command, it will ask you to probably create an account with the GraphQL platform if you haven't done so before, but you can just quickly authenticate with GitHub, and that shouldn't be a problem.
So if you have questions, you can also ask Robert. Robert, he's also a GraphQL expert, so to say, from Munich. And also I would like to thank him for kicking us off at Concentric, hosting us in the beginning. And we would like to do it there, but so many people just don't fit in. So thank you, Robert.
Genau, du kannst dann verschiedene Noten switchen und dann wird automatisch das Gerät NPM auch umgeschaltet. Ja. Und es gibt im alten Modul Kompatibilität. Habe ich die NPM-Version gekauft, sondern die Cloud-Version? 7.
Who has not deployed the server yet? Who has not deployed the server yet? Okay, most people. Who already created the first person object? Okay, so most people should be right there.
Ja, weil du hast jetzt komplett das ganze global, die ganzen Ergebnisse werden komplett umgeschaltet. Also jede deiner Node-Version hat eine komplette
Okay, and the last part in the README where it says how you can run the app, that part is not relevant yet. Sorry, I should have said that before. So we will get to that part in the end. We only care about the playground for now and about the queries and mutations. So we don't care about the front-end React application for now.
Okay,
Oh, okay, I have to select.
Du bist fast richtig, was du ansagen. Sowohl für die IT als auch für den Mail. Genau, und jetzt du brauchst also keine geschweiften Zahlen. Du brauchst nur dahinter steht das Specification. Also hier hinter der geschlossenen Zahlen, da ist Tränkler. Und jetzt kannst du genau, und jetzt in die Zahlen rein, etwas von mir. Genau, und jetzt kannst du sagen, okay, ich will jetzt die ID von der Person zurückhaben und den Namen oder sagen, hier sozusagen ist jetzt wieder ein Free-Mode, wo du den Fields abfahren kannst. Kommt drauf an, was du jetzt machen wolltest. Wolltest du jetzt noch eine Person? Achso, dann brauchst du keine ID machen, weil die ID wird automatisch generiert. Genau, da brauchst du nur den Namen. Genau. Das ist sozusagen basierend darauf, wie du deine Features so heißen dann die Felder für das Team. Also automatisch generiert, genau. Automatisch generiert. Jetzt hast du zwei Mutations in der warte mal, wie hast du Create User da? Ich glaube, Create User ist nicht genau. Du musst Create Person verwenden. Aber okay, warte mal kurz. Wie hast du glaube ich? Gucken wir noch mal kurz in deine Zeit.
Das war jetzt auch nicht. Wir haben das Ding lokal hochgeschoben.
Muss man bitte nochmal ich würde sagen, darf nicht, weil genau. Und dann hast du das richtige Datenmodell und kannst du mit der arbeiten, das du nicht wieder. Das sieht so aus, als hättest du aus, dass du jetzt am Anfang diesen Default-User-Teil kreiert und entsprechend da so dann auch genau. Mit der Tab ist das Problem mit der ID, weil ich keine Daten kann. Das ist überhaupt kein Problem, aber du kannst hier oben den Operation ID weglassen. Ja, ich kann es machen. GraphQL ist mal gespannt, das hängt auch, ich glaube, das hängt hier nicht. Ich glaube, das hängt bei uns zwei an. Wir müssen nochmal fragen, wer mein Kind, weiß ich gerade nicht. Das ist ausgeschlossen, dass eine Message wenn sie mit Google nicht unterbringen.
Viele machen Jahre in dem Serverort. Gibt es aber Top-Level-Vorgesehen?
Ja, genau. Eigentlich brauchen die es in beiden gerade noch nicht, weil wir nur eine Begriff
ja, weil der letzte ich meine auch gar nicht wichtig ist.
Genau.
Das ist egal. Ja. Weil viele machen es in dem Serverordner und da geht es halt nicht. Und dann,
okay, ja. Genau. Hey. Kann ich sie nicht adaptieren? Ja, Deutsch. Okay. Hast du wahrscheinlich auch schon ein paar Mal probiert, oder? Nee, dann probier vielleicht einfach nochmal so auf. Oder sonst probier einfach mal auf Graph.com zu gehen. Ja, ja. Verwendest du Tricks im Browser?
Ja, nee, weil ich habe erst bei mir
okay. Ich war mal bei denen im Office, ja. Müsste dann eigentlich eine Frage.
Aber ich muss mich dann anmelden, oder?
Genau.
Mit der CLI.
Genau, also das CLI wird das Browserfenster öffnen und dich da fragen zu identifizieren, aber wenn du dich da auch wieder mit GitHub oder so, soll das eigentlich hoffentlich relativ seamless Okay, dann brauchst du am Ende einfach nur die Kamera. Nein, sorry, nee,
Musst du das und dann doppelt werden. Also ich soll jetzt hier eine Message.
Okay, who has not created their GraphQL server? Who has not deployed a GraphQL server? Okay, so who came or who got through the first exercise and created a new person object? Please raise your hands. All right. Who got through the second exercise and created a message object for that person? Nice. And who actually managed to find out how you can filter? Anyone? Nice. Okay, a couple of people. So in the interest of time, I would say that we continue. You will get a second phase where you can play around with the playground. And then we go into the actual live coding and demo part. So let's quickly continue because I want to introduce a new concept. So for now, please put your attention to the front again. You'll get some time to work with the playground in a bit again. This never works. Close your laptops. Okay, it'll be pretty fast, I promise. So the next concept which I want to introduce are query variables. So for the queries that we've seen so far, for the queries and mutations which we've seen so far, we have always hard-coded the different arguments that we could pass to the fields. So if we have a query like this, where we're asking for a specific message, we hard-coded the one right inside the query. But what you can do, of course, when using GraphQL, you can replace this with query variables. And when you're using query variables, you have to declare the name of the variable and the type on top. And you can actually think of it somewhat as a function in JavaScript, for example. So in JavaScript, you have the function keyword that declares that this is a function. Here we've got the query keyword, which declares that this is a query. Then a JavaScript function has a name, function foo, for example, and here you've got the query message query, so you've got the name. And then you can put a couple of parameters that you can pass into this function, and in the same way you can pass these parameters to the query as well. And then you can just use them by referring to them by their name. And of course you can do exactly the same with mutations, where you can also just replace the hard-coded value with a variable that you're passing into the mutation. So how does it look like when you're working with query variables inside a playground? In the playground, in the bottom left corner, you've got the section where you can specify query variables. And this expects just the value for the different query variables that you specify on top. So here we have a query that has the search text as a variable, and then in the bottom you provide this in the JSON format, and that's all you have to do. So here will be new instructions for you with query variables, but before I quickly want to show you how you can use them. So here is the query variables pane. And if I now go ahead and write a query here, and I'm using a search string indeed, of type string. So now it actually says that this is never used, so we have to go and use it somewhere. So here I'm going to provide a filter and want to ask for someone with that particular name. And then we also have to provide that value down here. So we called the user Sarah. If I have a typo, and we won't get that user return from the server, I'll also include that here. But if we actually go ahead and match it exactly, then we expect that person to be returned. And we can also filter for like the name contains a string, and then if we go back and provide the wrong spelling of the name, then it'll still be correct because Sarah without an H is included in Sarah with an H. All right, so this is how query variables work, and now you get some time to explore these as well with basically the same instructions as before, but this time you can try to use query variables, and we will take like 10-15 minutes for you to work on these instructions.
Genau, und zwar jetzt hier mal zum Beispiel. Genau, und dann Moment, du bist im falschen Projekt. Genau. Und du jetzt auch gerade hier komplett in der GraphQL Console drin gelandet bist und nicht nur im Playground. Du kannst theoretisch nur den Endpoint, den dir das CLI ausgespuckt hat, kannst du theoretisch nehmen und hier in den Browser einfach quasi reinkopieren. Aber kannst eben auch über den Playground regeln, und hier hast du aber eben die komplette Console, die auch den Game Up, den Data Browser und den Schema Editor. Das hast du in dem normalen Playground nicht. Du kannst es hier einfach, das ist eine Pfeil und dann kannst du es einklappen und dann hast du das Schema Editor. Und jetzt kannst du mit deinem tatsächlichen Datenmodell auch arbeiten. Genau, und jetzt kannst du sagen, create message oder create person. Dann Klammer auf. Ja, genau, Klammer auf. Und jetzt, du kannst auch immer eine Control Space benutzen, um wirklich die anzeigen zu lassen, was du hier gerade schreiben kannst. So, und jetzt, genau, wir können das mal, tun mal das Create Message in eine neue Zeile, also einmal genau, und auch die letzte Brace hinter, genau, und jetzt hinter der Klammer zu hier nochmal eine geschweifte Klammer. Genau, und da kannst du jetzt sozusagen die Felder abfragen, gleich ist wie das. Eine Mutation war ja immer, ich will zuerst was ändern und dann kann ich wieder abfragen. Also hier ist es jetzt quasi wieder exakt wie eine Query, und hier kannst du jetzt schreiben, okay, ich will jetzt Text und ID und sozusagen sämtliche Informationen, die du wieder haben möchtest. Genau. Bei der Create Message bei den Create Mutations kannst du, oder du kannst nie überhaupt eine ID setzen, genau, weil die automatisch analysiert werden. Also eigentlich müsste das jetzt stimmen, ich glaube. Wenn du Send-By machst, dann, weil das eine Relation ist auf ein User-Objekt, jetzt müsstest du nochmal sagen, was willst du von dem User haben, weil hier steht jetzt erstmal nur, du willst sozusagen jedes User-Objekt, hier hinter ist jetzt, genau, und jetzt musstest du nochmal fragen, ich will jetzt die ID von dem User. Ja, aber genau, aber ich würde auch einfach mal sagen, wir schicken vielleicht kannst du einfach mal das beide wieder rausnehmen. Genau, und jetzt einfach mal abschicken. Genau, du kannst auch. Okay, ist required. Vielleicht ist es besser, erstmal mit Abschlossen anzufangen. Also ich kann ja einmal kurz erklären, wie wir das überlegen. Steht dafür, Send-By und Type Message is required. Können wir noch mal kurz ins Datenmodell gucken? Genau hier auf der linken Seite. Ich glaube, hier steht bei Person bei Send-By ist hier der Ausrufezeichen. Und das heißt, du kannst keine Message erstellen, die nicht einer Person zugeordnet ist. Genau, hier ist alles mandatory.
Du musst immer alles übergeben, aber du kannst trotzdem den Person noch erstellen, weil hier dann am Anfang einfach einfach eine leere Liste erzeugen wird an Nachrichten, die dieser Person dann von vornherein zubauen. Nee, das kannst du hier nicht rauslöschen. Okay, ja, ist gut.
Das heißt, ich erstelle jetzt genau.
Probier's mal in einem anderen Tab. Das Problem ist nur, dass die Variable irgendwie reserviert ist. Ja, das ist ja leider nicht. Du musst trotzdem oben einmal sozusagen Tree und dann die Variable einmal
Yeah, great.
So what's happening is
ohne Anführungszeichen.
I have an old version. And I wrote my own server in Docker container. Yeah, that could be the difference.
Is it safe? Yeah. Okay. It's just asking me. Maybe. Okay. So you already created one. So just one command again.
so there's no way to like look this star running cell.
I think so. You have to another if you like command. Du hast es schon mit Variablen gemacht.
Okay, who thinks they've got a pretty good grasp on query variables? Who managed to send a query with a query variable? Okay, so it's not too important of a it's not too important that you understand the details right away, but you'll get more and more used to it as you work with it, of course. Let's continue now and actually talk about the feature that we're going to use to build the real-time chat application. It's going to be a real-time chat, and that is achieved with a feature that is called GraphQL subscriptions. And subscriptions are actually the newest feature in the GraphQL specification. So they've been put in there, I think, only in April or May this year, so relatively new. And they effectively allow you to have event-based real-time updates inside your application. And they work in the way that the clients need to subscribe to specific events that can happen in the backend, and then whenever that event happens, the server is going to push the related data, the data that's related to that event, to the client. And they're usually implemented with WebSockets, which give you a steady connection between the client and the server. So let's take a look at an example. Again, what's nice about subscriptions as well is that they follow, again, the same syntactical structure as queries and mutations. So you don't have to learn a new syntax to be able to use them. And the way how it works is that the client is going to send over this subscription to the server. And once it did that, you'll have a steady connection between the client and the server, and the client is waiting for the event to happen. The query or the subscription which we send over here is asking for all the events that might happen on the message type. What could these events be? These events could be either that a new message is created or that an existing message is updated or deleted. So we are effectively subscribing for these three events. And when that happens, we want to learn what is the text of the message that was created or updated. And this is what this subscription effectively means. So now that we have this steady connection between the client and the server, let's assume that a third client will actually go and send a mutation to the server that triggers the subscription. So some client sends over a mutation where it creates a new message with the text hello. Then the server is going to take this information and push it over to the subscribed client. Let's assume another mutation with the text hey. The server is going to push this message again to the client, and another one with greetings. Again, this will end up at the client side. So that's basically how subscriptions work. They allow you to have this real-time mechanism for your application. And before you're going to try subscriptions yourself, I quickly want to show you how they work in a playground. So exactly in the same way that we did before, we can go ahead and we start with the subscription type. We don't have to specify the name here, so we can give this a name. We could say new message subscription. And then we have to specify the type of which we are interested in the events. So this could be the type message. And then if we want to know what the text of that new message is that was created, we just specify it under this node field here. If you're wondering why this is called node, this is just how the GraphQL API that we provide for you is structured. There are a couple of reasons. We can talk about this later. I don't get into the details right now. But effectively what you can do, you can, just want to reload. You can start the subscription by clicking on the play button. But now, instead of getting the data right away, we're just seeing this little loading indicator right here, because we're now waiting for data to be pushed from the server once a new mutation actually happens. So let's go ahead to the create message mutation again and send it. And then we'll see that now we have some data here where we expect the data to be that we receive from the server. And we can do another one. And the subscription again fires, and we've got this message right here. I think somehow you're also able to see previous ones. All right. Quickly want to show you one more thing, how you can filter for specific events. So here on the root field of our subscription, which is called message, we can provide a filter. And in that filter, we can say that we want the mutation to be in this array of either created, updated, or deleted. And now, again, we ask for all the different events, but if, for example, we were indeed only interested in created events, so we only want to receive data when a message was created, then we could go and delete the updated and deleted from this array, and now we actually say that we're only interested in created mutations. Let's do one where we're only interested in updated mutations. Let's start it again. And if I now send the create message mutation one more time, we don't expect to see any data, because we only subscribed for created events and not for updated events. Does that make sense so far? Any questions, by the way? I haven't asked if we've got questions. Cool. Okay, so then you get the last section inside the playground. Here are the instructions. And then we'll get into the front-end part where we're building the React application. Nee, tatsächlich eigentlich nicht. Manche Subscriptions sind manchmal ein bisschen buggy im Tränkler. Ja, da sind wir noch nicht 100% auf der Seite. Erstmal bin ich mal es gibt zwei Möglichkeiten. Du bist jetzt einfach hier in der Console gelandet, wo du sozusagen ein komplettes Überblick über dein Projekt hast und eben auch noch Schema Data nicht. Du kannst auch einfach nur den HTTP-Endpoint nehmen und in den Browser reinpasten. Aber es macht von der Funktionalität keinen Unterschied. Also du könntest auch sagen, also es gab vorhin, als die GraphQL Deploy ausgeführt hast, den HTTP-Endpoint ausgeschrieben. Ja, hier drin kannst du jetzt GraphQL Info einfach machen und dann spuckt er hier noch raus. Ein kleiner Tipp, ihr könnt anstatt GraphQL auch GC schreiben. Das ist genau das da. So, hier hast du jetzt nochmal die Endpoints und hier brauchen sie eine Simple API. Und den kannst du einfach genau entweder so alles. Und genau, es nimmt sich aber nichts, du kannst es mit der Konsole kann sein, wobei es sollte eigentlich immer funktionieren, es sei denn, dass ein Syntax ist. Also wenn irgendwo ein Syntax-Fehler ist, dann ist es, glaube ich, normal. Genau. Also es ist so, dass die Shift beginnt dann. Ich probiere mal zu
Hier ist
Sorry, but I don't know why I'm not
so there's one little thing you forgot to declare the variable up here in the header. So before the break, after the machine before the break, you have to or declare the variable and it's so first the name with a dollar sign. With a capital. So you're using it where expected in the layout first, so you use square brackets around the
Yeah, I'm sorry. What happened? Why? No.
Maybe that was it, but then try to use the name. So
I'm going for a beer.
okay. Ja, also ich will auch nicht sagen, dass ich Konzept war. Wenn ich jetzt eine Nachricht nochmal an der Seite. Genau, das ist die erste Creation.
Achso, genau, dann brauchst du entweder eine End oder ein Or, beziehungsweise End ist eigentlich das Default, wenn du willst jetzt was genau machen. Ja, jetzt habe ich gerne zwei. Achso, du willst das Array mit den Usern. So. Du musst das noch vormachen. Du kannst eine Argumentation, wo die ganzen Texte drin ist, dann besitzt du da siehst du jetzt diese Getränke vor und die Array von sozusagen später an die Themennamen. Ja, aber mit dem zweiten kann man nicht ganz genau. Und jetzt einfach nochmal die gleiche Zeile, nochmal mit Name und dann mit Zeit. Sie braucht jetzt fragst du halt die Person, die entweder aber hier habt ihr jetzt gerade Schutz von jeder. Es gibt hier einen Schritt, ich kann es gerade noch sagen. Also, aber hier kriegt ihr jetzt noch einen Namen. Nein, wir kriegen achso, ihr wollt, okay, ihr wollt filtern. Okay, verstehe. Dann, hier nicht die das heißt, ich kann nur auf dem ID-Feld direkt ID-Schicken und ansonsten nicht richtig. Das ist auch wichtig, weil ich sage hier mal sozusagen Dokumentation von genau. Und bei der Zwischenkey ist es dazu gerade nach einer einzelnen Person zu checken. Und das könnte sozusagen nur, wenn du das weil das ist das heißt, wir können nur Felder hier eingeben, die Liste sind die Name ist nicht genau, Name ist nicht aber dafür könnte es in dem Datenschutz genau, es gab ja das Datenschutz bei der IT stand ja nicht directed.
Aber du hast schon recht, das wäre auch noch interessant.
Manchmal ist es so, dass die Themas auch nochmal also Meister kann ich das. Genau. Falls du es abgeschickt hast, auf jeden Fall. Also einfach nur die Leute war kein Sensation.
Gleich fragt er mir auch. Also ich war auch
probier einfach mal zu. Habe ich schon. Hast du? Ah, okay, dann hier sieht das von mir. Genau, stimmt hier.
There's almost something that I just haven't read no browser ever, typically.
Sagt er auch tatsächlich, hier siehst du auch einen roten da.
Ich glaube, es ist viel.
Ich gewährt gerade. Danke dir. Nee, oder? Doch, hat er jetzt abgegeben. Theoretisch habe ich schon auch bei 2 gewesen. Ja, nur das. Nee, jetzt. Aber jetzt brauchst du auch, wenn du jetzt was Neues anlegst, einen neuen Message anlegst, dann kannst du aber genau.
Refresh funktioniert, oder?
Und dann kommt der reagiert.
Achso,
Wie funktioniert es? Also ich muss alle 2-3 Mal aber ich habe auch
ja, es gibt so ein paar Sachen. Ja, okay.
Ja.
Ja.
Aber ja, welche Technologie ist
So you first have to distinguish between GraphQL and GraphQL, right? So GraphQL is the true language for specification. GraphQL is our server implementation. With GraphQL, it's possible for sure because they are like you've got all the power and needed. Just defining a schema to an existing API. With GraphQL, well, with GraphQL, we always spin up a database for you, and it's going to go against that data flow. So exactly. So we assume that you're starting out with a new project, but we don't have a solution for when you need it for an existing. Right. So you can integrate with legacy systems, but that assumes the API gateway. And this API gateway, in fact, is a GraphQL server that you have to write yourself. So these parts are green because they are part of GraphQL. This part is not directly part of GraphQL. It's like a layer that you put on top of GraphQL where you can then integrate with legacy systems. It's a bit tricky. But so if you want to connect your or
So if you want to have a GraphQL server that is talking to your legacy systems, then you still have to build that server yourself.
You have to fill it by yourself.
Okay, yeah, so you could either go and migrate your existing database to a GraphQL project and put all the data that you have in your database into the GraphQL database, or you get lost the database. No, it should be some implementation. For example, okay, I see. Yeah, we cannot really handle these cases. It's all things. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we hear all these ideas, but we have to start somewhere. So, like, we start at yes.
Und dann eigentlich gibst du ja eine erscheint an den
Ja. Ja. Hold on. 1 second. Ich wollte es lieber sehen.
Oder es gibt Funktionen definieren. Was ist das Gleiche dann, ja?
So, und da ist halt gesagt, hast du das immer und du steigst immer auf das Neue. Aber das System ist auch das Handwerk. Sehr schneller Vertrag, dafür gesagt. Auf jeden Fall vorher. Ist auf jeden Fall eine Du hattest gleich noch eine Frage? Schon gleich. Okay, danke.
You can effectively host it on a private platform. So when you deploy it, you deploy it on a shared platform. You can also host it on a private platform. You don't have that option in the CLI. If you want to do that, then you have to talk to us and we'll handle that for you. We have a couple of customers who are doing that. You don't have an automated process for everybody to provide first a couple of customers who try it out, and then we'll see how we can automate it. Yeah, so you can actually go at Graphcool/cloud and there here in the console, it was possible in the previous version until maybe 2 weeks ago. It's not possible at the moment anymore, but we've been asked that a lot, so maybe we bring that possible. So at the moment we do that all with the CLI and with the types of GraphQL. But so because it would be difficult otherwise to orchestrate the changes. So if a developer makes another one makes sense, and that's why we made that decision. But yeah, maybe we will.
All right. Who managed to get the 2 subscription tasks done in the playground? All right. Who struggled really hard with the playground and things just didn't work because dependencies were missing or something? Or bugs in the playground? Bugs in the playground. That's the worst. Okay. So let's turn our attention to the front end and the chat application that we want to build. So before we get into the actual chat application, I want to say a couple of words about the concept of GraphQL clients or GraphQL client libraries. So what GraphQL clients effectively do, they provide like a nice interface to the GraphQL API. So usually when you're working with JavaScript and when you want to make an HTTP request to the backend, the easiest way to do so is just with using the fetch function, providing the URL, the HTTP method, and all of that. And you could perfectly communicate with a GraphQL server with that approach. So you're just using fetch, you're specifying that this should be a post method, and then you put the query into the body of that post request, you send it, you get the data back. So it's all very, very close to what you're doing when you're working with the REST API. With GraphQL clients, you have a little bit of a nicer workflow, and they're abstracting away these lower level networking details for you. So you don't have to take care of actually creating this HTTP request with fetch. You just have basically an object, the GraphQL client, that you instantiate once with the endpoint of your GraphQL API. So this client then knows the endpoint that it needs to talk to. And then whenever you want to send a query or a mutation, you just define that mutation and you pass that to the GraphQL client, and the GraphQL client will take care of all this, creating the HTTP post request, sending the request, parsing the response, and also if you're using a client like Apollo that we're going to use, and if it has a view layer integration, you'll see that when you're working with React, it's actually much, much nicer, because then you don't even have to manually work with the data that you receive, but the GraphQL client will receive the data from the server and then put it into a cache and then just make it available in the props of your component. So you don't have to take care of this whole data fetching process at all anymore. All you need to do is write the query, give that query to the client, and then work with the data in the props of your component. We're going to see how that works. And there are 2 very popular GraphQL clients at the moment. The first one is called Relay, and that is the homegrown GraphQL client from Facebook that they open sourced alongside GraphQL in 2015. Relay is very, very powerful and very heavily optimized for performance, but it's also like relatively complex and really has a learning curve if you want to get into it, and also doesn't have the best documentation. So what we're going to use today is the Apollo client. And Apollo client is, provides a much better getting started experience, especially if you're not yet familiar with GraphQL. Overall, just a really nice workflow. And they actually just released Apollo Client 2.0 just last week or the week before, and that's also what we're going to use today. So let's take a quick look at the application that we're going to build. So the React components that we're using is that we have this chat. This is what the UI looks like, and this whole thing is managed by a component that is called chat. Inside the chat, we've got the chat messages component that is going to render a list of individual chat message components. And down here, we've got the chat input component. And because I created this project with Create React App, we also have an index.js and the root component of our application, which is called app.js. So these are the components that we're going to work with. And these are the 6 steps that we're going to take. And because it's already 9 o'clock, feel free to leave whenever you're tired or something. I'm not mad at anybody if you do so. Feel free, but we have got 6 steps ahead of us that we want to implement. The first one is that we need to configure this Apollo client instance. So we have to instantiate the client. We have to pass it our HTTP endpoint. Then we have to make sure that we fetch and display all the messages. Then we want to create a new person when a user opens the chat in the first place. Then we want to be able to send messages. That's step 4. Then we actually want to bring real-time functionality into the app with subscriptions. We need to configure them and then display them in the chat.js file. So this is what we're going to do. If you already cloned the repository, that's good. I think a couple of you didn't clone it yet, so if you haven't done so, you've got the time to clone it now. And we'll do it in the same way that we did before, where in the beginning, I will show you what to do, and then you get some time to reproduce that. And the way how this is going to work is that I'm actually not going to do any real-life coding, but I've got all the steps prepared. And I'll just copy it over into the corresponding file. I'll explain what's going on, and then you get time to type that. So let's start. Here is the app. I also want to start it. And here we have a very, very nice chat application. Where we can send messages. And these messages, they actually appear on the screen. But if you reload the page, then they are all gone, because currently they are only stored in the state of the chat component. So if we actually go ahead and look at the implementation, here we've got the chat component, and in the chat component state, we have this all messages array, and at the moment when we are hitting the on send button, or the send button, then we'll just put the new message onto the state, and that's why it's being rendered. So this we want to replace now with the actual data from the server. And the first thing we need to do, if we remember the list of things that we have to do, the first thing is to configure the Apollo client in index.js. And here is what that looks like. So finally the React code, yeah. All right, so we're importing the Apollo provider from the React Apollo package that somewhat works similar to the Redux provider if you've worked with Redux before, and we have to wrap our root component with it in just a bit. Then we have to provide instantiate the Apollo client right here, and the way how we do this is providing a link, the HTTP link, which knows our HTTP endpoint, which is this, plus the ID of our service. So our Apollo client now knows the endpoint for our API. And then we're also instantiating a new cache where the Apollo client can put the data when it receives it from the backend. And then finally, we have to go and wrap our app component in this Apollo provider, where we are also passing down the client. So all the React components in our component hierarchy now have access to the Apollo client's functionality. All right, this actually changes nothing about the actual functionality at the moment. We only instantiated the Apollo client so far. So you'll get some time to type this now, and then we'll go into the next step to fetch all the messages.
The message. Aber haben wir jetzt eine Anleitung dafür? Was soll das denn?
No. Sieht nur so aus.
Who is not done with the part yet? Okay, let's wait half a minute or a minute and then we'll go to the next step. Genau. Ab dann wird das richtig spannend. Ja. Das ist jetzt alles nur vorgepickt. Wie immer, vielleicht hat sich auch irgendwie beim zweiten Mal kann man es ja, also Subscriptions sind im Playground ein bisschen buggy. Ich will nicht ausschließen, dass da an der einen oder anderen Stelle mal funktioniert. Ja, ich weiß ehrlich gesagt, da kann ich dir dann die Buggy nicht so Okay, if you're not done yet, maybe you can check with your neighbor, but we're going to move on to the first query that we're going to send in the application, and that's in the chat component. So here in the chat component, we now want to get rid of the all messages array in the state, and also where we used it, we now have to replace it with something else. So let's go ahead and put that in. This is what the query is going to look like. I'm just going to paste that in right here at the bottom. So in here, this part is just plain GraphQL code that you also used in the playground before. So I can literally go copy this, paste it into a playground, and we'll see the corresponding results. So this query, and I'll paste it here, and we get this back from the server. So this is exactly the GraphQL code which we now have here as well. And what we do with it, we pass it into the GQL function, which is a GraphQL parser that is going to create the abstract syntax tree of this query. And we need that so we can pass it to the Apollo client. How do we do it? How do we pass it to the Apollo client? Let's go ahead. I want to show you how that works. So here, instead of exporting the default chat, the plain chat component, we are wrapping the chat component with the GraphQL higher order component. So this GraphQL higher order component is provided by the React Apollo package. And what we pass to it is the query, or the abstract syntax tree of the query, and then an options object where we can specify the name of the prop that we expect to be injected into the component. So again, let's recall how this data fetching process now works with Apollo client. We're passing the query to the Apollo client. Apollo client is taking care of all the networking logic under the hood. It's going to send the request and put the data into the props of our component. But how can we access it inside the props of our component? This is the name of the data that is injected. So all messages query. So we now have to go into the chat messages part where we still have the all messages from the state. And this we're going to replace now with the data that was fetched from Apollo client. And this all messages query is the name of the prop that we specified down here. The last thing that we need to do is we need to import the GraphQL and the GQL functions. So let's do that here. So now everything should work. And if I go back to the chat, yes, so this is still from the service that I used before. Let's quickly replace it with the one we have here. And now we're going to see all the messages that I created in the playground, which were hello, hey, greetings, and hi. All right, so now you get the time to write that. We've got the all messages, let's see. Actually, we can fold this here. Let's see if we can get everything on the screen. Okay, so we leave this on, and then, so in a few minutes I'll scroll up here and you can see how exactly you access this stuff here. Or actually maybe we can just replicate it like this, but, well, is it possible to open it twice? Yeah. How can I do that? Yeah, in WebStorm it's working. I can also open it in WebStorm. But I can open it in WebStorm. One second. Okay, all right. Except that now it's not, it's too narrow. Let's do this. Okay, I think now you see the relevant parts. On the left is the top where you see the imports and how you can use it in the props. And here is the query, which is what you have to write at the bottom. Ja?
Immer noch alles. New Message noch irgendwie noch drin. Ja, Gottes Willen.
Die Molinari anschauen. When you are going to
Also wir haben kein Bett essen. Ich bin sehr voller Nachdenken, das jetzt irgendwie jetzt auch. Aber trotzdem muss ich gerade so absuchen.
Normalerweise ich glaube, die Webseite zumindest nach meinem Verständnis ich weiß nicht, warum hier ist. Uns interessieren eigentlich
Kompromisse zu schreiben.
Genau, ich wollte sagen.
Genau, den habe ich hier. Genau. Das ist von Personen. So, und dann gibt es okay, okay. Aber versucht schon. Man sagt auch irgendwie, Patient-ID, dass es so typisch String ist, müsste eigentlich eine ID benutzen.
auf diese URL zu gehen.
Dann müssen wir auch Seht ihr das so weit?
For free bekommen. Das ist noch nicht
All right, who can see the messages that they created in the playground on the UI? Who can't see the messages on the UI because bugs and dependencies are missing? Also a few people. Okay, so let's still move on. If you still have trouble, you can ask your neighbor. But let's move on with the next piece of functionality, whereas we want to create a new person when a user visits the site in the first place. And where we are going to implement this is in app.js with the create person mutation. So here I'm going in app.js now, and I'm adding the create person mutation right here. So again, it's going to be very, very similar as with the query before. We define the mutation in plain GraphQL code right here. So again, this is the plain GraphQL mutation that I could paste into the playground just like this. We're taking this mutation in the string, passing it to the GQL function, which is going to create the AST, and then we're using this and passing this to the Apollo client. And again, we're using the GraphQL higher order component for that. We're passing the AST and again this name option right here. But this time it's a mutation, it's not a query. So we don't expect the data to be available inside the component right away. But what Apollo is going to do instead is it's going to inject a function into the props of your component, and you can call this function by this name. And what that looks like is this. So I'm going to replace the part where we just take this person data, which is hard-coded at the moment, and I'm going to replace it with this, and also the way how we put the data into local storage. And then also we have to make this if you function like this. Is this working? No, I think this should work. So here what's happening is that we're using this function that was injected by the Apollo client in our props. It's called create person mutation because that's what we specified down here. And because this create person mutation expects a variable, which is a name, we also have to provide this variable in the variables object that we're passing to the function. So this is just a regular function call where we're now passing the name argument, and this is going to be passed into the mutation down here when the Apollo client is sending that over the wire to our server. Then we're taking the results, and we can retrieve the name and the ID from the result because we specified both in the selection set, and then we're putting them into local storage. All right. And of course, we have to go and import the GraphQL and GQL function again. So this time we don't have to type it. Just copy it from the chat. And now, if I can actually go ahead and check the all persons query and see if we created a new person. And was it not called? Did I forget anything? Let's see. Did anyone spot my mistake by any chance?
Yeah, you have the search string set.
I have the search? No, but, well, no, so here it should return on, but so it didn't seem to work. We didn't, so let's just maybe put breakpoint here.
There already exists person in local storage.
Right. That's it, of course. Debugger. Thank you, I'm pretty sure that was the issue. So now we've got this random name that was generated, and we also see that this was just created with 1 hour time difference. All right, that's how it works here, and now you can go and type that yourself. Do we need 2 windows again, or is it? No, I think that should work, right? I think you see everything you need.
Ich habe da eine Message, stand in String drin, aber etwa Typ ID. Und das war's dann. Das hat natürlich die anderen beiden Teile verpasst.
Fehler hat er mir
Bei mir nur Schock.
Fehler hatte ich auch.
Ja, leider. Also das erste war was für die ID besonders gefunden worden. Das Projekt-ID. Das Projekt-ID.
Ich wünsche mir was vom Frontend, was für den Frontend sehr gut ist. Aber ich bin ja auch von Fullstack unterwegs.
Ja, das ist leider nicht zeitgleich, weil das hat man ja mit Rails, das ist im Grunde genommen auch eigentlich sehr einfach, was da stattfindet. Also es ist auch ein Transformationsplattform, der mit dem jeweiligen Endpoint und der Metric, also wir dann einmal die Verwendung des SQL, du hast ja auch mal damit. Und dann verknüpfst du mit dem Namen hier und sagst dann, das ist und schon kann er wohl auch den SQL befügen und holt ihn aus der Tabelle und baut dann das JSON. Das ist nicht so viel aus. Also wie gesagt, du kriegst ja diesen JSON, du schickst ja diesen JSON weg. Dann wird dieses JSON aufgelöst, die Parameter ausgesucht und dann SQL befügt, den Name definiert hast für diese maximalen möglichen einfachen Parts. Dann kommt das Ergebnis, diese SQL-Type-Table zurück wieder und das Ergebnis für den Feldnamen wird dann auf dieser Struktur und dann zurückgeschickt. Und deswegen brauchst du dann die Reihenfolge bestimmen, die Hierarchie bestimmen, weil das braucht für dich alles dann aufgenommen.
Ja, bauen Service. Da musst du das ist unterschiedlich. Dann musst du
tatsächlich baust du Diese Art von Abfrage kann man auch. Dann nutzen wir mal Parameter, die du also so ein Sicherheitsproblem.
Ja, aber deswegen frage ich mich, wie verrate ich das Backend? Automatische Backend. Alles automatisch.
Any message we have in the playground. Yeah, all messages that you edit.
Why would it not subscribe? I didn't add any messages before on the person. So when I add a message,
So there was one problem that a few people pointed me to. That's actually the same problem which I ran into as well. So if you implemented this mutation and you refreshed the browser, then it probably didn't work because you already had a value in local storage, so the mutation wasn't executed. So the solution to that is to go into the console and use local storage.clear, and then local storage is completely cleared again, and this mutation is actually going to be invoked. Who ran into that same problem, or who's still running into the same problem and is now happy about the solution? Okay, who actually got this to work and the mutation is now working and you created your person? Right. Let's move on to the next step, which is where we want to implement the send mutation for our message. And for that, we're going back to the chat component. And we have to implement the create message mutation right here. So below the all messages query, I'm now going to put the create message mutation that we define like this. So again, the plain GraphQL code right here. It's always the same workflow. We are defining a plain GraphQL operation inside a string. We're parsing it with GQL, and then passing it to the Apollo client. Here, actually, Apollo client, or the React Apollo package, provides a convenience function that's called compose, which we have to import alongside the GraphQL higher order component right here. And this allows us to conveniently just wrap our chat component with two GraphQL operations. So we're exporting the result of the compose function call here, where we now have a GraphQL call to the with the create message mutation and the all messages query. So now we not only have the all messages query inside the props, but again a function that is called create message mutation. Where do we have to call that function? Inside the onSend method right here. So rather than updating the state, what we're going to do is we're going to invoke that function, passing the variables that it expects, so the text and the sent by ID, which are exactly the variables that we define right here as well. And if we do that, and if we head back to our application, and I write something, we're not going to see anything on the screen because we haven't implemented the real-time part yet. But if I refresh the page, then hopefully we see the new message on the screen. Right, so now you get time again to implement this. Let's see. Let's do to. So here's the onSend method. Also don't forget to import compose, and then here's the bottom on the right with the mutation and the export statement.
And where's this user ID coming from?
Sorry?
This props user ID.
That's passed from the component. Yeah.
Ah, all right.
Again, that depends on your GraphQL server implementation. So you can simply build the GraphQL server yourself. You can implement the file API in there. If you're using GraphCool, we currently don't expose files to GraphQL. We have a specific file API that just
I know this is string, but this is string different formulation.
When you send the GraphQL, it's just post it as a JSON payload.
This is
so you would, that's a good question. So,
because all variables you can request for, I mean, you can encode small files, basic whatever thing.
That's a good question. I actually don't know. I don't know if there are any other questions.
Or you send through just normal post request.
I don't know. And you can research if there are any best practice around this. I don't know how you would solve that. We have
open source and both
yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sure that people already thought about this, so I'm just not the right person to ask.
Dann bist du bei Rails hier. Das ist das Models, das sind die Datenbanken. Du hast ein Komponent, in dem Komponent ist dann erstellt am Namen. Das ist beispielsweise Namen. Die ID wird automatisch hinzugefügt. Dann hast du einen Customer und dann sagst du nach E-Mail, beste Referenz, also das macht dann Rails zukommen. Genau, das gleiche macht er einmal für die Adresse, Customer ID, zu dem macht er die Referenz auch. Somit hast du eine richtige Datenbank jetzt, mit Relation.
Also das Company, Customer und Address?
Genau, so wie hier. Company, Address und genau, Customer und dann kommt die Adresse. Das ist für die Aufbau. Und das Schöne ist jetzt hier, das GraphQL bedient sich in jedem Augenblick, weil du GraphQL Feldnamen zuordnen musst, Company, kann das jetzt komplett in ein SQL-Statement umwandeln.
Was notiert werden darf, was eingewiesen werden darf.
Ja, klar.
Du machst so
Das ist so ein Feld, an dem du sagst, was du dann ein Recht, also das kannst du entweder im Controller machen und sagen, füllt es vorher das raus. Oder du suchst ein Feld und sagst, das sind die Möglichkeiten, die ihr machen, die ihr abfragen. Also, genau. Also, genau. Ich weiß es bei dem so nicht. Ich weiß bei Rails geschrieben und habe dann einfach geschrieben, hier darf man lesen, jeder schreibt und lesen möchte, jeder darf ablegen, jeder darf gar nichts haben. Und die kannst du manuell Sachen Rails setzen selbst schon mal. Das heißt, du hast einen Hypermeter, genau. Er kann dann wirklich dann, das ist eine Konvention, alles was dann diese Konvention einhält, wird automatisch Relation gemacht. Und dafür brauchst du nicht als Webentwicklung, du kannst die Custom-mäßig, das ist doch mal Custom-mäßig ansetzen, wo du sagst, das ist meine harte SQL-Profil und das soll er bitte dann auf meinen Internet noch sicher zu geben. Aber das kommt ja nicht wieder hin und baut dann diese ganzen Feeds automatisch ab, indem wir den Datenbank mit abstellen und dann automatisch passiert. Das war bei Rails. Das wird auch wahrscheinlich für andere Produkte, ja, aber auch für schon ziemlich weit.
I think that's this whole thing replaces it. No, it's actually then give it in the story. And the story was also idea is that you have all of your instead of
also dein Controller, der ist erst und ich mache auch gerne recht hast, also dass du gar nichts gemacht hast, dann wirst du abgeführt, das ist ganz abgearbeitet. Du gibst den Regel direkt raus. Genau. Genau, das kannst du hast dann, nein, du hast beim MVC Crumbling Update, Create, Delete. Über dieses kannst du dann diese Daten zum Beispiel auch sagen, das kannst du glaube ich auch gar nicht schreiben dann, mit Blöd zusammen.
Ja, ich meine,
hier ist es ein bisschen Apollo, das ist anders jetzt hier. Ich habe nur damals ohne Wechsel. JavaScript klingt sehr unverzerrt. Genau. Du machst jetzt einen rechten Test. Klasse. Nein.
Library, which is the Scala reference implementation for GraphQL. And then custom implementation, which can okay, so that is AWS Sporrer, shared cluster. If you host it yourself, then yeah, we're planning to support more in the future, but it's just one step. Well, I can't exactly tell you why I also am not involved really in they just want to use like really proven and mature technology. I don't know if it's longer it has to be, right? It's 1.0, so
all the time if you want
well, you can say that
All right, who managed to implement the create message mutation and it works when you're hitting the send button? Who did not manage to do it? Who is lost with that mutation? Maybe I'll come to you in the next section, but let's move on with the subscription part. Because now we actually want the message that we're writing and sending to appear on the screen in real time. And the first thing that we need to do for that is we have to update the configuration of our Apollo client. And we actually not only have to provide it with the endpoint for our HTTP API, but also with the endpoint for the WebSockets API that represents the subscription API. So let's go ahead and do this. And let's start just with the WebSocket link first. So who here has used Apollo Client 1.0 but not used Apollo Client 2.0 yet? A few people. So if you've used Apollo Client 1.0 and you haven't seen anything about Apollo Client 2.0 yet, then this link concept is probably not yet really familiar to you either. And the way how it used to work in Apollo Client 1.0 was that you actually only had what was called a network interface that you passed into the Apollo Client constructor instead of this link. In Apollo Client 2.0, they replaced the network interface with the link concept. And the main reason for that is that it allows you to very easily implement middleware for your requests. Essentially, you can imagine the process of sending a request with the Apollo client by starting with the GraphQL operation. So you start, for example, with the query that you have defined and that you're passing to the Apollo client with the GraphQL higher order component. And the GraphQL client takes this all messages query, which is defined here. So it takes this code and it sends this code through a chain of links. So these links represent the middleware. And this allows you to intercept the process of sending the request with custom functionality. So you can use this, for example, to attach authentication headers to the request. So if you need to authenticate requests, you can write an authentication link. You put that into the chain of middleware links that you're using, and then when this GraphQL operation is passed through that chain of middleware, at some point when the authentication link is reached, then it will just attach the authentication header, and that's now part of the request that is going to be sent over to the server eventually. We work with a relatively simple link setup in this example, so we don't really have a chain of links, but we still need a second link to implement the subscriptions. And that's what we do right here. So we're using this WebSocket link that we instantiate with the subscriptions API endpoint. Quick note, a quick side note, by the way, if you ever need access to your GraphCool endpoints again, you can go into the server directory and you can use the GraphCool info command, and this is going to spit out all the different endpoints for your API, and among them also the subscriptions API endpoint. So here's the endpoint that you can use to instantiate this WebSocket link. And then you can also pass a couple of options. So here, if the WebSocket connection breaks, we just tell the Apollo client that it should just reconnect. And here you could also attach, for example, an authentication token again, or something like this. And what we have to do now to make this work is we have to concatenate these links. In fact, we're not really concatenating them. It's not the very best example. We're splitting them because we have effectively two categories of GraphQL operations that we want to send through the Apollo client. The first category is query and mutation that follow this request-response cycle. So for this, we want to send the GraphQL operation to the HTTP link to our regular GraphQL endpoint. If it's not a query or a mutation, but a subscription, so the second category, then we want to, the operation to go to the WebSocket link. And that's precisely what we implement in the split function right here. So we first pass this function that defines whether the operation is a subscription or not. And if it's a subscription, then it'll choose the left link, which is the next link that we're passing into the split function, the WebSockets link. And if it's not a subscription, then it's a query or mutation, then it'll go to the HTTP link. So you can really imagine the split function as like a part where you can specify a route, a path inside the middleware chain. So you can route specific requests through a particular middleware or a different middleware. And what we have to do then is just use this link and pass it to the Apollo client instead of the HTTP link. So this link now combines the WebSocket link and the HTTP link, and you can actually omit the second part here if the key and the value in your JSON object have the same name. So here we end up with only the link and then cache, where we still instantiate the memory cache here. And the last thing that we need to do, of course, is to import the corresponding functions and other components that we're using. So now we have configured our WebSockets. That was the second last step, and then we're actually going to use the subscription. Yeah, so you can start typing that now. You tried it? Ah, okay. Okay, all right. All right, so we have effectively two deployments. You can either run on the shared cluster, which is what we have here, or you can run on a private cluster. On your own infrastructure, and basically your AWS account. So in the future, we will support multiple infrastructures. Now we want to start just with AWS account. So you can run your application on private cluster. And have a lot more flexibility on this side. Because in the shared cluster, we also have a couple of limitations. For example, we can't really guarantee stable performance within a certain threshold on the shared cluster, because just like by the nature of the shared clusters, you might have what's called the noise and label problem. If on the same cluster you have another application that's running and there's a lot of traffic, then your application is running the same cluster, and we have the rights of protecting your application from that. So if you need this really stable performance, we recommend you to go with a private cluster. But yeah, other than that, it's totally great. Yeah. No, it's a problem with so it's usually a problem with data. I mean, I don't want to say that we're 100% bug free. But yeah, we have a lot of customers who are doing that. If we have downtimes, which has happened in the past, then we do like status updates and explain exactly what we're doing, how we fix it. So we have we provide all the information for transparency. That's the follow plan.
Because when I want to use mutation afterwards,
I don't think that you can do that, because I think Apollo Plan uses it for like their caching implementation. So maybe you could. That's a good question.
Because when you click on the it's like when you click on it, that's not a problem. When you type in, let's say, the message to the user, then another, then you have to, and then you have to.
You have a lot of
version,
kann man direkt aufmachen. Auch da mal ein Beispiel machen.
That's also not my domain.
Maybe you know because
Genau.
Und dann wird die nur das zurückgegeben, was verlangt wird.
Genau, in der Struktur. Genau. Das heißt, du hast die Kontrolle nach dem Sprint.
Einfach hier im Backend. Du implementierst einfach nur die Rückgabe zum Projekt. Und das macht die dann nicht. Und die eigentlichen Sachen, die jetzt Geschwindigkeitswirtschaft eigentlich gar nicht in der GraphQL drin, sondern die ersten Kommandos, die du definierst. Deswegen
genau, das war manche das Kommando.
Ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob das GraphQL oder ob das GraphQL
Nee, das ist eben, das meint auch ein anderes Teil.
Who still needs time to implement the subscription setup?
So optimiert abzunehmen, dass dann und Transformation sofort im Laufe müssen zum Launchen das bekommen. Das ist immer wieder mehr Übungen, ein bisschen umgestalten, direkt schnell durch die Zeit machen. Ich stelle das auch so liest auch, dass ich das durchgehe. Auch die Komponenten zu sagen, das ist ein Hauptobjekt, dann gibt es mir das auf diese Komponente also das auf die Stückchen Elementar. Weil du kannst ja eine Abfrage das ist die gleiche SQL-Abfrage in beliebigen Kombination, wo du mehrfach Aufrufung machen, wenn du es brauchst, bräuchtest. Das ist formatiert so. Man entwickelt für das aber nicht in der verschiedenen Positionen.
Das könnte ganz gut matchen mit dem JPL. Wenn du die Applikation brauchst, dann jetzt zum Beispiel Company und
genau.
Company und
genau.
Im Hintergrund passiert auch nichts. Das müsste eigentlich, müsste man Ich weiß nicht.
Wie was?
Ich weiß nicht, ob das meiste Beispiele sind so die statische Daten.
Bei vielen Systemproblemen wie weiß es funktioniert. Noch einmal.
Das ist one character.
Dann kommt die Bearbeitung. Steht letztes Mittel auch so.
So you don't have
Das ganze Geschichte ist nicht.
Also bei mir zumindest, ich weiß nicht, also man kann jetzt Gefühl. Also bei mir ja, compile. Die App im Browser neu lädt.
Well, let's just say that in the playground you've got more control. You've got the raw query, you can just hit the play button and you can like control everything here. You don't send the request like yourself because it's already from the client. So here, like you don't send a play HTTP request, you're using a follow client to send the request. So there's a bit magic going on.
Einen ganzen Array von Daten hochstellen, diese Datenbank zusammenkriegen und sich dann scannen. Nur die Felder, die auch dann drin sind, dürfen die Daten eintragen. Das macht dann das Array gerade auch, also der passt schon im Controller. Und wenn das dann aufgerufen wird, passt das schon die Sachen, die nicht abgespeichert sind, schon in der Box. Also, das müssen wir manuell machen. Wir stehen dann mit denen und sagen, du sagst ja, genau. Das erzählt man ruhig alles. Also, du hast mir eigentlich du sagst, du hast bei dir ein Fahrungsfeld rein, weil einfach vorher alles rausgescannt worden ist, was nicht abgespeichert werden kann. Das ist voll legitim.
Das ist schon ein Punkt, das ist ja richtig. Ja, damit kommt
das ist auch bei Race man natürlich Zahlen. Okay, aber das brauchen wir auch nicht. Aber das ist dann, genau, das ist dann der Überlegung, so wie das ist. Aber trotzdem echt schön.
Okay, let's get to the last part, which is where you're finally going to see the message to appear on the screen in real time. And so as a quick side note for the people who still made it until here, I also have stickers here, so feel free to grab these stickers as a reward for your persistence. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do to get this real time to work now is to add the subscription inside the chat component. And again, this subscription, it's the same. It's the same approach again. We're writing plain GraphQL code inside a template string. We're passing this template string to the GQL function, and we're then somehow passing that to the Apollo client. And this again is a subscription that I could paste like this into the playground. So it's effectively exactly what you did in the last playground exercise, where you also use subscriptions inside the playground. Here it's just the GraphQL code for a subscription where we are subscribing for new message events. So whenever a new message is created, this subscription is going to fire, and it's going to deliver this data right here. How can we now actually use this subscription and set it up? Well, we use component.mount. So when the chat component mounts initially, we are using the all messages query. So this all messages query still is the one that we got through the first GraphQL higher order component which we used here. So this all messages query also exposes a function that's called subscribe to more. And when you're calling this function, what's going to happen is that the WebSocket connection between the client and the server is going to be established, and we can pass now the AST of the subscription up here. So this new message subscription, we're passing to the subscribe to more function. And then we've got this update query function here that we're passing as well. What is this update query function? Who here has worked with Redux before? Or knows like the principle of a Redux reducer? So this update query function works in a very, very similar way as a Redux reducer, in that it gets the old state, and this old state here refers to the previous result of the query. So what the Apollo client initially fetched from the server with this query is now stored inside this previous state. And now the second argument to this update query function is the new thing. Just like with the Redux reducer, where you're getting the new state and the thing from the action, and now it's your responsibility to merge this inside this function and return the result. And that's precisely what we're doing here. So we are first retrieving the new message from the subscription data. Then we're passing that, or we are concatenating that to the previous state or messages. And then we just return the result of this. And this magically is going to update the UI, because we're updating the all messages query inside our props with the new message that we just received. And this is all you have to do to get these subscriptions to work. Let's see if that is actually true. And there it is. It appears in real time. All right, so I'll let you build this yourself so that we're complete here. What do you need to see? It's not quite working out. I'm going to open the second one to make sense. Maybe I can just put the state somewhere else.
In the GraphQL, in the Apollo documentation, it says there's a props option in the GraphQL function. Can you also use that instead of component.update? Component.mount? I mean, when you connect the initial query at the bottom to get all messages, we specify a name, right?
Yeah.
And there's also a props option in the object. Can we use that as well instead of component.mount?
This option is just to map the props.
Yeah, so
the Apollo client passes to your component.
Yeah, so like you might have the situation where the query, so here you could potentially also pass like a variable to the query here, right? If we actually wanted to make this here a variable, we could say, okay, we want to pass like the variable in here, and that's of type int, and then we're using count in here as well. But how can you now pass this into the variable? And that's what you're using the props function for, and you can now like so if the chat component now has a props that contains this value, you can map it to the variable right here. So I don't think that you can use it for the subscription functionality here. So I'm not sure, we can talk about it afterwards also if you want. But that's what you have to type here. All right, so that should be enough for you to see. So every time it gets called, the previous state will just like be updated with the new thing that's in the new state.
Form or something, and you display the form fields. You display like the contemplated pipe, then you can save, you get the values of the form, you can put it into your mutation. Right? So you wouldn't just copy the it's a rare case that you actually pass through the stuff that you got from the query into the mutation. Right? You have a list of all the form fields somewhere anyways, right? And this list you can just use. This list you can use to filter out all the stuff from the response of the GraphQL that you don't need. Right? So you have a list like you have name, age, born, I don't know. You only need these three in already. You just have a list of keys. You can use this list of keys to filter out the information that you don't discuss. So that's a really straightforward to get I would actually use that form library, like with a form or something, and that will just give you the form values that you have, and let it tell anyone, right? And that's probably a good idea to do that anyways, but I wouldn't call it an hack, because we like our project so we're already using the form library, and it will already give us the values of the input fields, right? So that's why I don't see have a problem yet, right? No, but I totally agree. It's super convenient to have to do that. Yeah. So maybe they'll find a solution eventually. But again, like to me at least, my project is quite an edge case. We never had. Sorry? We actually use both of the ones that I mentioned. So we use React form, but we're now just trying out forming. React form is, I wouldn't say too complicated. Just having a few basic architectural decisions. I don't really like storing like form state in Redux. It's a great idea because you're basically updating your whole store, but the parts of the store anytime you type something, which is not a good idea. And it's not static, you want to just like after you put it, okay, then you can store it in Redux. While that's good, but after you blur the field, so not while typing, but if you exit the field or stop typing, then it's okay. But while you type, it will always like trigger functions for every keystroke. So if you type fast, it will trigger the functions, and you have a big form. Like for us, we have products with 1,000 attributes, then it will get really slow. Or potentially, you have to do it. And like React form and forming, they work pretty similarly with their APIs. And it will always just give you the form values of the fields that you have rendering page, and then you want them to do so React form actually doesn't have any exactly.
still the same? Yeah.
Also ich meine hier, ich bin eigentlich dort auch Recherche, aber nach meinem Verständnis macht das ja nicht anders, als quasi zuzuweisen, was das initiiert wird, das modifiziert und das mir erstmal das ist halt keine Referenz auf diese Verbindung. Also ich glaube, das ist halt noch später testen zu können oder wenn du es nicht machst, hast du halt so eine denkende Pointer, also irgendwas, was halt nur rumgeht und aufzeigen will. Genau, das ist der einzige Grund, es müsste auch nicht geschickt werden.
Du solltest jetzt hier um die Scheibe wenn es ein Jahr einfach gibt, wenn der Präsident vorhanden ist, also das ist die Select, das ist ja ein Schiff, da hast du dann SQL-Liste. Oder aber du bist alle. Also schon hältst du dir Sachen zusammen.
Yeah, nice.
Aber den du selbst dann.
Okay, if it's working, grab your sticker, of course.
Im Griff. Bedienung selbst.
Okay, I think we can close off here. So the code will be uploaded to GitHub. So if you didn't manage to really finish everything, you can just check out the GitHub repository with it. I want to close with 2 more slides, and then we're finally done. So if you want to learn more about how to GraphQL, I want to recommend you a couple of resources. And the first one is the How to GraphQL Full Stack tutorial website, which has a lot of tutorials for front-end and back-end. The GraphQL weekly newsletter and the GraphQL radio podcast to keep you up to date about everything that's happening in the GraphQL community and ecosystem. If you want to work with GraphQL on a daily basis, then you should check out our jobs page or talk to me or send us an email. We're hiring. And that is all that I have today. And thank you so much for staying until the end. That's very nice. Okay. Let's take some questions, I think.
Yeah, I'm curious. I have 2 questions. The first one, if the Apollo client for Android and iOS, if you have experience in that and if it works well. And the second question is, if you want to build a new architecture and you want to also connect GraphQL with a database, which one you would use it? Because I don't know, I was thinking about CouchDB, but I want just to hear it from you that you work more.
Okay, let's start with the first question. That was the mobile clients from Apollo, because the Apollo team is actually building GraphQL client libraries for all major development platforms and also the mobile platforms with Android and Swift. And the 2 clients for Android and Swift, I've actually worked with both myself. I have a background with Swift, so that was a little bit easier for me to get into. Both of them haven't reached version 1.0 yet, and I don't think that there is a lot of community behind them, so I don't know if they're exactly production ready, but it's still interesting to work with them because they actually follow a different approach than the Apollo client on the web. They're mostly trying to recreate the same APIs, but what both mobile clients are doing in a different way than the JavaScript Apollo client is that they're both using static type generation. which means that at compile time, they're taking a look at all your GraphQL queries, and they're generating corresponding Swift or Java classes for these GraphQL queries, which gives you a lot of safety when working with the API. So you're not passing the abstract syntax tree of a query to the Apollo client when you're working on the mobile platforms, but actually dedicated objects from these generated classes. You can work with the Apollo client on mobile. If you're using GraphQL on mobile, then you should be using them, I think. It's still the best way of using GraphQL on mobile, but they are not as mature as they could be, that's for sure. Second question about what kind of database to use with a GraphQL server. I think that really depends on you and what you are comfortable with. The most support and the most tutorials and documentation you will find around a classic stack with like MongoDB and JavaScript, where you can also use the data loader library, which is a library that's also built by Facebook, that is like basically an optimization library that you can use for working with a database. Graphcool, for example, is implemented with SQL under the hood. But it really depends on what kind of technologies you feel comfortable with. At least from my perspective, I wouldn't say that there is one database that works better with GraphQL than another.
Thank you.
Could add to this question, there's a really cool tool to access a Postgres database. PostGraphQL.
Yes, exactly.
And it inspects the database or a schema of the database and ports automatically at GraphQL.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting tool to look into. It's interesting because they are basically implementing the reverse approach of Graphcool, where with Graphcool you start on top and you define your data model in the GraphQL schema definition language. You start on top and we generate the database schema for you. What PostGraphQL is doing, you start at the bottom, you define your database schema, and they are generating the GraphQL API on top. So it's kind of similar, but we start from different ends. More questions? Yeah.
Is it possible to write my own resolvers for using with this platform? Because I don't want to directly connect only one database. I have multiple databases and multiple services which I want to query through the API.
Yes. The way how you would do this is by effectively building a GraphQL gateway on top of the GraphCool API, and then you can use tools like schema stitching, for example, where you can, if you want to integrate with another GraphQL API, then you can use schema stitching, which is also a relatively new tool, which allows you to take two GraphQL schemas and merge them into one unified API. But you can also just write plain resolvers that are accessing an existing database or a microservice or a third-party API. That's where you can put all that logic. GraphCool at the moment actually also has the feature of using or of integrating resolvers right into the platform, but we are kind of moving into a direction at the moment where we favor the gateway approach rather than trying to use these resolvers that are integrated in the framework. All right, if we don't have any more questions, then again, thank you so much for coming.